Good morning. My name is Ross Sandler. I'm Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to the 146th City Law Breakfast. We like to start on time, so we're going to start even though some of you have not gotten through the table. So please continue, get some coffee or orange juice or whatever, and there are plenty of seats in the front and in the back, so we welcome all of you. Let me welcome you to the City Law Breakfast. I want to thank, first of all, our founding sponsors, the Consolidated Edison. Frances Reshevsky, Senior Vice President, is here. We honor her and that company. The law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Ed Wallace and his people are here. Thank you. And then Verizon, Richard Windrum. Thank him and Verizon for being founding sponsors. We also want to thank our special sponsor, Castellanos and Ritholtz, for sponsoring this breakfast, and we are very happy that they did that. Claude Millman was the originator of that, and we thank them. We also like to thank all of the people who have contributed to this breakfast. There's a contribution form on the tables. Those of you who've made contributions that keep supporting these breakfasts get a gold star on your nameplate, so that's certainly worth it, and I hope that you will contribute. So let us begin. I want to bring to the podium first the President and Dean of New York Law School, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross, and welcome to all of you. We are thrilled that you're here, and yet again, another packed house at New York Law School for one of our City Law breakfasts. And we couldn't be more proud to have First Deputy Mayor Tony Shorris here with us. And what I love is that he's Tony. I'm a Tony also, but when I was in City Hall for 11 years, I always went by Anthony, except when I went to Brooklyn, I was Tony. So I like that you just own it in every borough. And when I started here, some faculty members said to me, "What do you go by, Anthony or Tony?" And I said, in Manhattan, it's Anthony. In Brooklyn, it's Tony. They didn't get it. But we get it in city service for sure. In any event, we are really happy that you're here and very much excited to hear about all the progress of the de Blasio administration over the past 4 years, and I know it is vast and extraordinary. And we owe you a special thanks. I know I've said it to you before, but when we had the very sad and tragic crane collapse in February of 2016, you were one of the first people here and took immense charge with OEM and police and fire and EMS, and it was terrific. And we are grateful for your work and helping our building make sure that we were okay. We had a little damage, but the city was a great support in that, so thank you for that leadership. You have a really incredible job. I think we all know that the first deputy mayor has one of the most complicated and vast set of responsibilities of any municipal official, overseeing 20 plus agencies, working with the other deputy mayors, the first among equals in that role, and really coming to understand every facet of municipal operation at the ground level and how it impacts the lives of 8.5 million New Yorkers and everyone else who comes from the suburbs to work here, visitors from around the world. It's an immense set of responsibilities, and it is the only deputy mayor whose job is actually spelled out in the charter, who's mentioned in the charter. So it is clearly something that is all-encompassing and I think one of the most rewarding jobs next to being the mayor or the mayor's council for that matter. So with that, I will ask Ross to come back. I also want to welcome Commissioner Brand, who's here from the Correction Department. Very happy you're here with us. And we look forward to a great event today, so thank you all.
Thank you. I also would like to recognize Richard Gottfried, Assemblyman, who's also here. Thank you, Richard. I knew Richard when he was 21 years old. This is a really important event to have Tony Shorris here. I look around the room and there are many of you who not only know him but have worked with him, so it's a little maybe icing on the cake to try and describe his career. We all know he was a deputy budget director, commissioner of finance. He was the Deputy Executive Director of the Port Authority at a time in 1993 in the first attack, and he was the person on the scene at that time. He went on later on, he was the Executive Director of the Port Authority. He run the Langdell medical hospitals for NYU. He's been an academic at Princeton and at NYU. He was the Deputy Chancellor here in the Bloomberg administration in education, and now has come back as first deputy mayor. I first met Tony when I was commissioner, and I was told the most important person for my life as commissioner was the deputy budget director, and I should go meet him. So I went to his office to meet him, and it was Tony Shores, 28 years old, and he really was the most important person that I had to deal with. What I've learned about Tony, that he really has two very important sides to his personality that are wonderful. He is a progressive with very strong views that government should be a caring institution and has to take care of people. Very strong views, long-time views about those issues. On the other hand, he's a budget professional, and he has equally strong views on the limitations of city budget and how that has to be managed. And the idea or the thought that we have a person with both those sides to them as first deputy is really a powerful combination. We are lucky to have a person like Tony Shores as first deputy mayor. Tony, we welcome you to this podium.
Oh my God, this is very scary to see. It's like my life is flashing before me as I stand up here. It's like an out-of-date bar mitzvah. So anyway, thank you, Tony Crowell, which is all I'll use from now on, for hosting us here today, and special thanks, obviously, to Ross. I did, as Ross noted, meet him at OMB, one of my earliest jobs, over 30 years ago. He was a DOT. I was in essence, his budget examiner. In other words, my basic job was to torture Ross. And Ross fought fearlessly, tirelessly, I would even say endlessly, for his streets and his bridges, so much so that one of my bosses actually wouldn't speak to him for decades after he left his job, but he still invited me here today, and I very much appreciate it. And just like 30 years ago, Ross still devotes himself to making it a better city and a better world, and for that we all owe him a profound thanks. So it's been just about 4 decades since Ed Koch was elected, and my start in and around city government. I was, as you can imagine, young people tend to be, pretty sure of myself back then. It took a lot to get me to change my mind. Back at OMB, actually, I also handled the budget for the Department of Environmental Protection, and my job included signing off on change orders on big contracts, and I was definitely a budget tough guy. I remember well, I challenged a big change order for the third water tunnel. $10 million they asked for after some collapse in the tunnel that they were blasting. They'd have to prove it to me, I said. I'm going to go down there, and I'm going to see this myself. So they said, sure, come on down. So a bunch of burly sandhogs led me down hundreds of feet into the dark, moist earth. And first they said, you have to wear this yellow jacket. And when I asked why, they said, so we can find your body more easily if there's another collapse. It got my attention. Want to see the collapse up close, they said. Just a few more feet. Just don't slip, because that might disturb more of the rocks. So I walked more and more slowly, and as we proceeded deeper and deeper into the tunnel, walking ever more slowly towards the collapse, suddenly everyone stopped and appeared to be listening very closely. We're not sure what that was, they said, but we have to make sure it's not another piece of rock falling. By now, my hand was reaching for my pen. Fellas, maybe it's time to get that change order signed and get out of here. And all of a sudden, the third water tunnel was back on track. So I'm sure those sandhogs spent the rest of the day having a good laugh at the kid from OMB's expense. But anyway. So look, it's been a time of reflection for me personally. I turned 60. I started my 40th year of work. I recently lost my last parent. It's one of those moments when you spend some time looking back on your career and your life and the things that have given you the most meaning. And I have some sense of what that's been. It hasn't been politics. I ran once for New York City County committeemen, and after a week of knocking on the doors of strangers to ask for their signatures, I realized democracy up close was not for me. It certainly wasn't about the business of making money for its own sake. I had an interview at a bank after one of my periodic getting fired from government moments, and sitting under a portrait of J.P. Morgan in the waiting room, I realized I couldn't stay in the room with that guy, let alone work there, and so I ran, fleeing from the building. So over the years, I've found meaning in the hard work of making change, lasting change, alongside colleagues who, many of whom are in this room, to improve people's lives in the city we love. And that's why, for me, what's been going on in Washington, the sort of the cruelty and divisiveness and recklessness of it all has been such a nightmare for those of us who care about this. To see people so bent on dividing us and playing to our worst instincts, and people who seem to fundamentally not believe in the mission of government, to improve people's lives and bring people together, and sabotage the efforts of everyone who tries. It's obviously, you all know, a politics bred from and constantly fostering cynicism and anger and eroding the institutions and values we care about. So we need a lot of answers to this. I am hardly one to lecture on what those are, but I know at least one, and the one we've been focused on at City Hall has been to not so much argue with Trump, but to prove him wrong. And we think we can do that. We can do it by demonstrating the ultimate city of immigrants can also be the safest city in America. We can do it by showing that a progressive public sector can deliver on its promises, can be fiscally responsible, and can create real change at scale for millions of people. And that's a lot of the reasons I went back into government in 2014. I found a mayor who I'd known on and off for 25 years or so, whose values I shared, and a chance to realize those values at a time when the city actually was pretty strong and has continued to get stronger. I felt there was also a chance, though, to build the kind of government I always wanted to see and had been part of on and off over those decades, a government that was competent and inclusive and committed to the values I cared about and many of us in this room care about, of equity and opportunity and respect, working with people who shared that notion that government can improve people's lives. My job was to take those values and that vision and align the city government to deliver them, and in doing so to prove the Trumps and the Bannons of the world wrong every single day. And so that's what I've been focusing on in my work as the first deputy mayor, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about a little bit this morning. I sort of saw three core goals to what I've been trying to do. The first is to hold myself and the government as a whole accountable to the policy goals, the reason Bill got elected 4 years ago, to focus on equity and opportunity that were the centerpiece of his campaign and the promise he made to New Yorkers, and that motivated me for most of my life. The second thing was to try and improve the infrastructure of the government itself, to create lasting management change that makes the government better at getting things done for this administration or others that would follow. And third, to see if we could create a community of leadership and support and collaboration in the government that would encourage commissioners and the leaders in the government to work across disciplines to advance these kinds of goals. And so that's what I want to talk to you about, is those three things for the next 10 minutes or so. De Blasio ran, as you all know, on this focused policy objective of reducing inequality by improving the quality of life and expanding opportunity for working class and poor New Yorkers. So that's what I need to focus my work on and to align the government around, and to implement policies to achieve that. So sure, it started with economic opportunity. That was our primary focus, to help New Yorkers who feel more insecure every day because of the rising cost of living and the challenges they face. So we pushed that agenda with every tool we had. We brought free quality, high quality pre-K to every family. We invested in the most ambitious housing program in a generation to preserve or protect 200,000 units. We froze rents for millions of New Yorkers. We fought to raise the minimum wage to $15 and passed a law giving 500,000 New Yorkers paid sick leave and created a right to counsel for low-income tenants. But we also know that equality was about more than just the cost of living. It meant ensuring civic equality, the notion that we're all in this together, and recognizing that economic inequality is both the cause and product of so many other forms of inequality. That's why we created IDNYC, to help every New Yorker feel confident, whether they're filing a police report or trying to get in a public building, that they'll be treated with the same respect, whatever the status of their documentation. And that's why more than 1 million New Yorkers right now carry that card, and it's become a model for dozens of cities around the world. It meant investing in dozens of neighborhood parks through a community parks initiative focused on equity of access to parks. It meant creating the first comprehensive cultural plan for the city that focused on increasing support for arts organizations in low-income neighborhoods. But none of those would be achievable, I thought, or lasting, without trying to improve the core infrastructure of the government, the operations of the government. And look, I've spent my whole life in and around the public sector in this town, and I've seen and felt and been frustrated by the challenges of achieving change in the bureaucracy. Government operations, as those of you who've been in and out, and half this room has been in and out, know, differ in a lot of ways from the private sector. There's at least three that I thought were pretty central to the challenge we face: technology, procurement, and human capital management. So we've been trying to push for innovation in each of those areas in order to create lasting change that would improve the operations for ourselves and our successors. So we looked at technology not as an end in itself, but it's just a tool. It's a piece of the puzzle to improve accountability and alignment in the government and obviously efficiency. I remember that when I came back in 14, and we looked at the Department of Sanitation. It used to be, some of its commissioners are still here, when I started, one of the most analytically rigorous agencies anywhere, actually, not just in the city, but in the country, under Norman and Brendan and some others who ran it in those days. And I came back and I was very troubled to see it essentially frozen in time, bereft of new thinking for years and years. So we asked our new commissioner to put back advanced analytics into the operation of a kind of meat and potatoes agency like sanitation. And so she began revamping, just as an example, all the snow routes in the city, and we went away from tiered streets to sector-based streets, all based on a kind of application of operations research, something some of you Lurkios here used to teach that. Those are the kinds of tools we should be using in the government, and sure enough, it made for better snow removal. In the last 3 winters, we've had pretty terrible snowstorms and very few problems as a result. We provided mobile devices to every NYPD officer and put tablets in every police car. That's real-time information for cops that helps them access their databases and 911 stuff, but it also helps them know better what they may be walking into when they walk into a situation. And it's all part of the reason why crime has plummeted amazingly over these last 4 years. Murders are down 25% this year alone, after already being at near record lows the last 3 years. We also thought about how we're going to deal with the procurement process, which is another challenge in city government, a concatenation of rules added year after year after year, each one to deal with a crisis of the moment, and which cumulatively slow down the government in very painful ways. We've been looking at ways to change that. We, for example, modernized the background check process, the famous Vendex forms that some of you may have been burdened with. For generations, we're the only jurisdiction I can imagine that makes everybody fill out giant piles of paper every time they bid for a contract. It's crazy. So now we have a fast, clean, online disclosure process. Everybody does once and updates it with a flick of their finger and moves on. Better for vendors, better for us. We even looked at our outsourcing of technology and said maybe there are things that city government folks could do better. And technology is not always the most advanced cutting-edge component. There's a lot of technology that city workers would do as well or better than the private sector, and frankly at lower cost. So we brought in-house hundreds of jobs that used to be out in consultants, and that's part of the reason big projects like our 911 stuff ended up getting done on time and within its budget. And along the way, we used all these tools to expand minority and women-owned businesses to generate as much as $1 billion of contracts this past year. And then when it comes to managing the workforce, we walked in with 180 collective bargaining contracts, all expired. Partly a statement of the end of the Bloomberg administration and partly a view of how to deal with labor that was different than ours. Every single municipal contract was signed within a year and a half, and the whole workforce is under contract, and those contracts will start to expire, and we'll be back at the table again. But the point was, when we settled those contracts, it included a posture about working with labor in a different way, and one of the bigger products of that was the beginning of bending the curve on healthcare costs. And we made arrangements with them, and we hope to continue to make further arrangements that will begin to bring down the cost of care to taxpayers while improving the quality of health for the city workforce. Those savings in the first round saved about $3.5 billion in healthcare costs. We need to do a lot more because the cost of healthcare, the burden of healthcare costs on the city taxpayers is only going to grow. But finally, beyond setting and holding ourselves to goals around equity and opportunity or improving the core infrastructure of the government, I've also focused a lot of my job on creating a climate of shared values and support and collaboration among my colleagues. I've watched city halls over the years, and governments generally, some of which have worked fairly cohesively, some of which have been riven by internal stress and fighting, even infighting among officials. We didn't want that. Bill and I wanted to create a government that didn't suffer from that. And so our approach on it was, first we agreed we wanted to hire agency heads who, beyond their competence, which is obviously our first criteria for it, shared the goal, the policy and programmatic goals that we had of using government to expand opportunity and improve people's lives. And we felt if we could create people who had those that shared vision, we'd create not the team of rivals, which is clearly a way to run a big organization with people with very diverse opinions, and this one's a Cato Institute follower, and this one's a resistance member. We didn't go that route. We decided to go with a route of people who actually had a fair amount of ideological coherence. And I reinforce that in annual retreats we have with our commissioners and monthly meetings I have with the agency heads, except for Cindy, who I have to torture on a weekly basis. And in going over the performance metrics and the management tools I use to make sure they're tracking on those goals. But the goal, the notion we had in mind here was, had many ramifications. By having people whose values we felt were common enough with the goals that Bill and I had, it also allowed us to delegate more to those commissioners because we felt if they were both competent and shared our values, it would make sense that we could delegate a fair amount of authority to them, and we do. It also meant that the tension among the agencies would be reduced because they were primarily, when they disagreed, arguing over means and not ends. And once we take ends off the table, it makes for a very different discussion. There are tactical disagreements, and of course there's arguments among folks about this resource or that, or how to do this policy or that, but the tension level in the government, at least from my own experience, is much lower than it's been for many, many years. The final value or virtue of that kind of coherence, though, isn't even so much the delegation, although that's important, or the comity among the leadership, which is important. But I think it also begins to allow a sense of an ability for us to begin thinking laterally, to begin thinking across disciplines, a sort of interdisciplinarity, if that was even a word. Over the years, I've managed, as you've heard, doctors and architects and teachers and police officers and all kinds of people who do things I don't know how to do. But I've come to see now that one of the things that's common among all those spheres is that each has begun to realize that the core problems in their domain can't be solved solely within their domain. Cops now know that sometimes it's the visit to the psychiatrist or the social worker that's more important than the arrest. Teachers now know how hard it is for kids to learn if they don't have eyeglasses to see the board, if they don't have a place to study at home, if they don't have parents who get time off to take their kid to the doctor. And physicians know that healthcare is about a lot more than just what they do in the doctor's office. It's a lot about the patient's behavior and about the quality of the patient's management of their own healthcare and their understanding of it. The government's organized, like a lot of organizations, in what you might call a Fordist model. It's like a series of differentially specialized production lines divided by expertise, which is fine from the perspective of managing a large organization. It's not how people live. It's not how any of us live. And it's why we're working so hard to try and encourage that kind of lateral thinking, that interdisciplinarity that would allow people from various agencies to sit together to problem solve on each other's problems. So for instance, in 15 NYCHA developments, we brought agencies together to talk about reducing crime in a much more holistic way, to think about not just police presence, of course, but expanding youth programming, addressing the quality of life issues, lighting, scaffolding, trash pickup, that sends signals to people about what we think of them and how we care about them and how we expect them to care about their own community. And those initiatives have helped lower crime in those very same developments where we focused it. It's why we created more than 200 community schools, school buildings that can serve as places where community organizations and other government agencies can provide services beyond what takes place in the classroom, so we can change the way we think about education as something that we're all responsible for, not just the teacher in front of the class. It's part of the vast mental health initiative we put in place called Thrive that affects every agency and tries to recognize how much mental health is at the center of correctional issues, healthcare issues, criminal justice issues, housing and homelessness. So those strategies, clear values, an improved focus on the infrastructure of the government, a collaborative approach to problem solving, that's what's allowed us, I think, to have the safest big city in America, to have the lowest unemployment rate in half a century, to have the biggest drop in poverty in decades, to have the best educational performance we've seen. It's nowhere near enough, we know that. There's still far too much poverty in the city. There's still way too much anxiety about paying the rent and paying the bills. There's still way too many kids whose full potential isn't being reached and who need much more to thrive in the 21st century. But I think New Yorkers know this is a government that's on their side, and we work every day to give them a reason to believe that. I know I believe that. Yesterday morning, in sort of full circle of my life, I spent the morning 800 feet underground in the last leg of the third water tunnel. A perfect bookend. It's the third water tunnel that will fill with water by the end of the year after 50 years of work and actually a century after the first tunnel opened, and 35 years after that smartass OMB analyst lost his nerve in the tunnel with some of the same folks who are still working on it now. As I talked to those engineers and those sandhogs working on the project, a project that will literally last for hundreds of years, I thought about how proud I was of this government. Because having a government that cares about us and that can deliver on its promises, I think is the best and maybe only answer to the cynicism and anger that's threatening to undermine the promise of democracy in America today. And that's why we have to get this right. The stakes have never been higher. Thank you.
Terrific talk. Terrific talk, really quite wonderful. I hope that it's written out, I would love to publish that. As we have quite, open mics, as you know, and people who like to ask questions or to make short comments. I'd like to, no, you go to the microphone. I would like to, before that, I'd like to just acknowledge a couple people. Oh, first, I want to, Claude Millman will have the first question. Claude from Kostelanetz and Fink, which we honor, and thank you for the support. But I do want to just acknowledge three people in the audience. I know there are many of you who could be acknowledged, but Michael Rebell, who brought the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case, which is the centerpiece of the state's financing on education. George Grasso, former first deputy of the police department, now a judge in the Bronx, and Carol Kellerman from Citizens Budget Commission. Great institutions, and we're delighted that people of like those three are here today, and I know many others are as well. So we will now open the microphones. Where is Claude? Claude first.
I'm Claude Millman of Kostelanetz and Fink, and thank you so much for the excellent speech. It was very interesting. So I wanted to talk about the issue of the mayor's report that he issued back when he was the public advocate about the Freedom of Information law. And back then, the mayor suggested he gave a number of the Bloomberg administration agencies Ds and Fs with respect to FOIL. And suggested that agencies be penalized, essentially that people who can't get responses to Freedom of Information Act requests receive money. So back then they were getting letters saying it's going to be 30 days, 60 days, et cetera, and suggested that they be fined. And I was wondering whether that's something today, whether the mayor I'm sure it's very difficult for the mayor or even for the mayor's office to control whether the agencies are complying with the Freedom of Information law. And you know, if there are any agencies that are still getting Ds and Fs under the mayor's public advocate standards, whether a fine would be appropriate or whether the Vendex system that you talked about, now that everything is online for the agencies, whether that can, all the information other than the social security numbers and the birth dates could just be made available to the public online now as a means of solving at least some of that FOIL issue.
So, okay, I'm not entirely sure the Vendex piece of it, but on the FOIL issue, which I think is an important one, and I don't think we've done as good a job as we could on that for sure, and I think we're continuing to make improvements on that. I wasn't here when he made that particular proposal, so I don't actually know specifically what he was referring to. But the underlying issue of trying to improve the responsiveness and the level of responsiveness to FOIL requests has been an issue that's dogged governments everywhere, ours included. And, you know, the demands have gotten higher and greater, and it's backlogged a lot of our responsiveness for sure. And the issue of creating a sufficient resource to be able to respond more quickly to people who have inquiries is something we've got to continue to take a look at. I think some of the agencies have gotten better. I don't grade them that way. I'm not a grader of agencies. I think some of them have gotten better. I think as a city we've gotten better, but I can't tell you that we've gotten anywhere good enough for what we're trying to do. Our larger approach to transparency is, as you mentioned, I think more broadly, is to put as much data out there as openly as possible. And our Open Data Initiative has been, I think, one of the stronger ones in the country in terms of putting vast amounts of data out there for people to just look at and analyze and ask their own questions about. At the end of the day, you know, privacy issues are paramount, of course, and we're going to protect people. And we're under federal obligation on a number of those things, HIPAA and FERPA and so on. But fundamentally, the more data we can put out there so people don't have to ask, may I, but can do their own analytics is basically the way to go. And that's why the Open Data Initiative, I think, is going to be an important part of the answer.
Thank you.
Hi, Glenn.
Good morning. Glenn Newman, Greenberg Traurig, formerly worked for Tony at Finance. Putting aside the pending litigation on the property tax, challenging the entire property tax system in the city, is there going to be a proposal or a study or something to talk about property tax reform? And comment to that is, I think that you need to look at the overall tax picture. It's not isolated. As you talk about integration, property tax now can be integrated with the income tax. There are senior citizen and other exemptions that tie into the income tax. So if there is a property tax reform proposal, I would hope that it looks at the entire structure of city taxes and figures out where things should be to be progressive and to be fair.
No, look, Glenn, I think you're 100% right. These are some of the hardest issues we're going to face. The mayor said he does want to take that issue on. It's everybody in this room who's wrestled with this since 7000A and before knows how difficult this is as a political challenge, frankly, for the public sector to deal with. And it's not just a city issue. There's nothing locally the city actually can do. It's a state legislative matter ultimately. And ultimately, anything we propose or have a nice notion about is still going to go into the maw of the Albany legislative process. And last time, 40-some years ago, required a court action for that to happen. It's a very difficult issue because it tends to be a zero-sum game, and those are the hardest things for people to wrestle with. At the same time, the larger point you're making, which is I think a fair one, is the tax infrastructure is also dated. And we do tend to think of it in a very siloed fashion as if there's no relationship between them, but of course people pay all the taxes. And so understanding the burden on various kinds of individuals by income class and other, or just disabled status or anything else, means we do have to think of it more comprehensively. That makes it even harder, Glenn, as you can imagine, right? And you know. And the more we make the scope bigger, so we're not just going to look at the property tax, we're going to look at the whole tax structure of the whole municipality, which, by the way, is a little hard to do without looking in a way at the state tax burden, since it's the same people paying the same tax. So now you've got a scope that actually looks at the city and state liability, and it's all potentially about to have radical shifts because of federal policy change, which we have obviously even less control over. So we're all holding our breath on state and local tax deductibility and the mortgage deduction and all kinds of other deductions that may or may not be affected by what's about to happen, or may not. So first, I think we should see that federal context, because it's going to change our thinking. Then I think we have to address the question of, are we going to look at the state and local tax burden both? We've made a number of suggestions about how to make the state system more progressive and our local tax more progressive on the personal income tax and so on. But if we're going to challenge the whole underlying nature of the property tax and income tax structure, I think it's going to be a pretty big challenge for anyone to take on. And I think I would be kidding myself if I didn't recognize how difficult that would be for Albany to digest.
Roger Hers, TIME, and an acronym for To Improve Municipal Efficiency. First, thank you for your good work over so many decades, and it's fascinating to see how some ideas that we advocated a long time ago, semi-radical, and they've moved to almost a now mainstream. I would like to join in an effort to open up data. The misuse of FOIL, a current example, actually since 2000, the MTA decided in 2000, when Virgil Conway was chair, to protect then Governor Pataki, to require a FOIL request for anything. Now, the intent of the law from 1974 was, in case there was a doubt as to whether something was a public document, to set up a procedure. The city has representatives on the MTA board, and I would urge that this was never put in writing. This was done only verbally, so it could be resolved with, I assume, signing a piece of paper.
Oh, I wasn't actually aware that was MTA policy, so I'll definitely talk to the folks about it. Obviously, I assume you're making the same suggestion to the leadership of the MTA, which is probably in a
Yes,
position to make this change more easily than our four measly
so
members.
ingrained as a corporate culture.
Yeah.
I'll send you some details.
Okay,
on it.
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm a U.S. Navy veteran. I was also here on December 16th of last year when the commissioner of HRA was here and made false statements. So the question I have for you is, the mayor had a public meeting last night at Town Hall on Houston Street. I'm a whistleblower, so the question really is this. If whistleblowers have a legal right, a First Amendment right, pursuant to the U.S. Supreme Court case of Wood versus Moss to attend those public meetings, at what point is your office and the mayor's NYPD security detail going to stop violating those rights? Particularly Howard Redmond, who's a defendant in a federal civil rights lawsuit as I speak.
Well, there's enough lawyers in this room who probably would guide me not to respond to a specific legal matter, so I'll take the vibes of their advice. So I don't know the specifics of the case, and I obviously wasn't at the meeting last night, so I can't speak to that. All I can say is that we have been trying to improve always on the level of transparency, both of information and of access. The mayor's been out there now twice a week, really, for the last few months, and months before that, trying to meet with community folks in those forums, but in other forums as well. He's not limiting it to town hall meetings. So people can have access to him and to the government and to talk to them. I don't know what comments you're referring to a year ago, obviously, but
About legal assistance?
yeah, I don't know what the context of those was, but all I want to say is that I think I would be the last one to ever say we're doing everything we can. We can always do a better job on that. That's what our job is. I do think our intention here is to try and be as accessible and open as any government I know of. There are imperfections for sure. I don't know, and I don't want to talk about whatever the legal process is around certain matters. It's not appropriate for me to do that, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But I do want to say that our value structure is that we believe we should be open and accessible to people.
And just
and their
one quick
concerns.
question. You talked about procurement fraud. So would you be willing to commit to ending contracts with companies doing business with the city that are committing wage theft?
I actually don't know the specifics of that. Obviously, you know we've done a fair amount of enforcement around issues associated with wage theft, both in the city and at the state level. I can't make that commitment now without understanding better the consequences.
Let's go to this side now.
All right. I'm
Hi.
Frank Moss. I'm a retired federal judge now working as a mediator. I have a fairly parochial question which raises a larger policy question. And that is, I'm concerned about the 14th Street Tech Hub rezoning, which seems to slowly but surely be substituting tall, shiny buildings in the Greenwich Village area for buildings that may not be historic but are low-rise buildings. I've yet to meet anybody who comes to tour Greenwich Village simply to see tall high-rises. And the broader question I would like to ask is, how does the administration balance economic development in projects like that versus preservation?
Well, look, it's a hard question, and it's a sensitive one. Ross and I both live in that same neighborhood, so we're certainly sensitive to those issues and hear plenty from our neighbors about it as well. But look, let's pull the camera back in a bigger way for a second on this issue. There's about 8.5 million people in the city right now. We know the demand for housing is extraordinary. It's part of the reason housing costs are so high. We also know that the future of the city is based on its ability to grow. It's been growing for the last few years. We've had tremendous growth in recent years, and we'd like to see more growth, actually. It's a great town, and more people should have the ability to share in it. That's not going to be possible without increasing the density of the city. There are ways to do that wisely and ways to do it foolishly. And doing it in partnership with communities has always been the hallmark of what we've been trying to do. It's why, frankly, the rezoning processes are slow, is because we try and do it in partnership with communities. But the end goal of trying to make New York both affordable, more affordable for the people who live here, and allowing it to grow, and those are two anchors of what we're about. If you go back to our One NYC plan, it begins with growth and equity as two central goals, along with resilience in that case and sustainability. Those are reliant on our ability to deal with the city's ability to grow. And if we don't master it in a way that aligns both of those and preserves the nature of the communities that we care about, and that's both the quality of life, and it's everything from the retail access to the affordable housing and open space and a variety of the other things that make places like the Village attractive, then we will not have stood ourselves in good stead. But I know we feel the pressure of people who can't afford to stay here anymore and need more opportunity for housing. And I know we feel the pressure and demand for more people who want to come to New York. And that's a good thing for everybody. It grows our tax base. We can't, and Tom Wright's here who thinks about this more than I do, but for too long the city has been carrying the growth of the region, and that's not going to go on forever. Too much of the region is down-zoned or flat-zoned itself, and that's not going to work if we're going to be a global city that continues to take people in and whose statue in the harbor still matters. So we are going to have to find a way to deal with this. I totally don't disagree with you, and I feel that particular one personally because I live near there, so I understand that challenge. But I also know that we can do it smartly, and I think we can do it in ways that allow the city to be strong in the future.
Thank you. Hi, Tony.
Hey, David.
One of the opportunities of mayoral control of the schools was to improve the kind of interagency coordination that you spoke about. So I'm wondering if you could give us a 1-minute case study about how that's done on some issue, whether it's homeless students, desegregation, the murder of a student in the Bronx, and what's being done to improve that interagency coordination.
Well, we can. Those are all excellent examples, David. And you know the system as well as I do. Let's just talk about homelessness, right, which is a tremendous issue for kids right now. We have, it's reported as 100,000 plus kids who are homeless. That may well include a lot of kids who are doubled up, which is not exactly homeless, but there are lots of kids in shelter. And they show, frankly, very poor academic results. And it's unsurprising because their parents are facing, and they are, incredible challenges in their life and particularly in their ability to get to school. We have therefore tried to engage a bunch of other agencies in that conversation. The primary one, of course, being Homeless Services. And so I've had a series of conversations with the Department of Education and Homeless Services, a series of investments that we've made to try and help kids better get to school. They're not going to learn much if they don't show up, so getting attendance up has been a first part of it, but then also addressing the particular issues. So we've put HRA caseworkers in schools, and we put DOE staff in shelter for example, to try and help in the larger shelters. We can't do it in all of them, but in those where there's a concentration of kids, to try and help understand what's the challenge. Why can't she or he get to school every day? We put a big investment into the busing system associated with getting kids from shelter to school. We're trying to look now in the shelter system at how to keep kids in their district as much as possible, because there were too many kids having to go across borough, across at least distant long trips. So the long trips discourage. We had to make changes in the HRA system about parental recertification, because too many parents had to come in and they often bring their kids with them, which means another day lost from school. So these numbers, I think, are still unacceptable as to how many kids in shelter are missing school. That's not a problem, to your point, that DOE can solve on its own. That's an issue at least with Homeless Services and probably with a set of other agencies as well. The mental health program investments in the schools obviously are not just for homeless kids, but they face a lot of challenges around. And having a social worker or a nurse or others in the school who might also be able to participate in the challenge of why that kid's not making it to school is another part of it. And then some of the homeless kids also face issues of violence, whether it's bullying or other issues. And again, the conversations that we now have regularly between the PD and the Department of Education about how to align better what they're each doing in the schools, and has taken down the temperature dramatically between the two agencies. Not that there aren't challenges, but they're not primarily between the agencies as much as they are in just dealing with an incredibly difficult challenge. Really poor kids facing very unstable homes in often struggling schools. So each of those agencies in that case, criminal justice system, the social service system, the educational system, those are giant bureaucracies, as you know. And getting them to collaborate with each other in a way that makes them not defensive, but rather share the common goal of let's talk about those kids and what they need, I think that comity is pretty high right now. And I think the conversations I have with the PD at every level, from the commissioner on down, very aware of what the social, economic challenges these kids face. And the relationship between the school system and the PD, which, as you know, had been at various points downright hostile, is now, I think, actually pretty supportive. There are moments and there are principals who still don't get along and all that. I don't want to Pollyannish, but I think the underlying objectives at the top are very well aligned, and I think that ultimately trickles down into the operating staffs. So
Thank you.
I think there are cases. Sure. Hey.
Good morning. I actually want to start by echoing Ross's praise for your initial remarks. I think it was a really amazing sort of overview of what it's like to try and achieve change through government. And I want to go on the comment that you made about the collaborative nature of your agencies, and I think that's really, we've experienced that positively many, many times. I want to give you one example of one where your agencies seem to be stuck, and not for lack of working, but without expecting you to solve it this morning. What you have today is your health department cannot license community center spaces in NYCHA because there are violations, not in the community centers, but in the homes, in the units. And as a result of that, DYCD's after-school programs cannot provide full services to the people in those community centers. And apparently this has to do with the lack of a C of O and a substitute document that the buildings department has. That's 4 agencies. And
I'm
as a
enjoying
result
this
of
one.
not being
I'm
able
really-
to
I'm loving
license
this
that
one.
space, the children, they get a basic program, but we can't take them on field trips. And the parents are quite upset about the fact that their kids can't go to cultural facilities. 5th agency. There you go. My actual question is not that I expect you to solve that. Just think about it. But could you comment on, to your point about equity and the city's efforts to achieve equity, could you comment on what the city is doing now about the potential, which I think we're beginning to see in Brooklyn, about the impacts of the tragedy and the calamity in Puerto Rico with families coming to New York City?
So just on your first point, you should send me a note on it, just because that's because that's
You
look,
got
that's what we do.
commissioner-level people trying to solve that. If you could help us, we
I'm
would love that.
I'm happy to try and take a look. I live for those. But Look, the Puerto Rico thing has been a challenge for everybody. You know, obviously starting with the people who are suffering enormously down there every day. But for us here in the city, we're wrestling with it in sort of two directions right now. One is we're trying to think about what we can do there. And so we have a variety of things. We right now have 150 plus people down there. We've been trying to work. We've focused more on the city of San Juan that we have a sort of sister city relationship with, and it's an urban center, so it's a little easier for us than rural areas. And so we focused a lot on stuff with the mayor in San Juan and her team. So we've been sending stuff, sending people, sending skills. We actually stood up. They didn't have an emergency command center. We built an emergency command center for them so they could try and do a version of what we try and do in ours. Again, they're in terrible shape on their infrastructure and general preparedness issues. And there's complex other challenges, political, whatever, down there. But fundamentally, we now have buildings department staff, OEM staff, NYPD staff, FDNY staff down there trying to provide technical assistance. B, we have about 1,000 city workers who have signed up and are ready to go. We just want to make sure that we have a specific thing for them to do. But we've had tremendous outpouring of city workers, and the bulk of whom are bilingual, so they're ready to be of assistance almost immediately, and a lot of them have family, of course. So lean forward. Plenty. I think, not surprisingly, more than any other American city. We're a bigger American city with a larger Puerto Rican population, so of course we're leaning forward more than anybody else. The hard question, though, and the one we're actually less certain about, is the issue of how many people are going to come
Right.
here.
Right, that's what
And, you know, right now the numbers have not been very large, a manageable number, but it's early and people can't get flights out and people don't have phones to get flights out and they can't get their money to buy the ticket to get the flight out, et cetera, et cetera. So the wave, we don't know. And we are doing a fair amount of thinking about what happens if that wave comes at various levels, frankly, orders of magnitude. Dozens of people, pretty manageable. Hundreds of people, probably manageable. Thousands of people, a different challenge. Tens of thousands of people, a whole different challenge. We have seen in the number of people who left New Orleans after Katrina, and the population permanently fell by 100,000 in New Orleans. They left, and many of them didn't come back, and a lot of them ended up in Texas and elsewhere. So we know that can happen. Obviously, it's different. It was geographically a short drive and so on, as opposed to a big, complicated airplane ride. So we don't know, but we are trying to gear ourselves up as much as we can. We've never faced that. We took hundreds and hundreds of people after Katrina into the city, and many of them stayed. We've taken people after every major American natural disaster. But we've never sort of land-based, because they could drive here or take a bus here. We've never had one where people fly in at any scale. So we are literally in conversation now with our partners, nonprofit organizations. We're in daily conversations with FEMA all the time about this, both FEMA here and FEMA there. To try and get a sense. We actually have people at the airports trying to understand the volumes of people and what their needs are. Most people coming now are coming to a family or friend. And most of them right now are coming temporarily and plan to go back. If that changes in a dramatic way, we have to be ready. So the chancellor is getting the school system ready. Steve Banks and the social services crowd is getting ready because they're American citizens and they have Medicaid and so on. So we're going through agency by agency. We'll have something to say soon about another big step that we're going to take next week on this to, again, put our readiness out there for an inflow. But right now, it's a complete guessing game, Marla, as you can imagine. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. I hope it's not tens of thousands, but, you know, there are 3.5 million people on the island. There's 800,000 Puerto Ricans in New York City or Puerto Rican descent. There's plenty of connection for people to come. So we need to be ready.
Thank you.
Let me step in here. We're coming close to the end, so the last questions will be the people standing on this side.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Tony. I want to first congratulate you and the mayor on the implementation of the Pre-K for All program, which in my mind was a rare instance of a politician having a grandiose vision, but then actually carrying it out on a large-scale basis. And I know that the plan now is to extend it to 3-year-olds, which is also terrific. My question is, The state committed to universal pre-K, and they committed a substantial amount of funding for a 5-year period. We're now in year 4. I'm wondering if you've had any communications with the governor, whether there's been any commitment. If this is universal, the implication was permanent. Is the state committed to continue funding at least at the $300 million level they have been for the last 4 years? My second question is, so far from what I've seen on the announcement of the extension of pre-K to 3-year-olds, the city's assuming 100% of the cost. As you know, in the CFE case, the state made it clear, the court made it clear that ultimately funding for education is a state responsibility. There again, are you talking with the governor and people in the legislature about getting some substantial state funding into both of these ventures?
So on the first part, no, I haven't yet heard a declaration from the governor or the legislature directly on this. Dick probably knows more about this than do I, but on the extension of the initial $300 million a year commitment to pre-K, I would find it personally hard to believe there'd be retrenchment on that after how well received that was. Now I think widely acknowledged as an important step for kids. But, you know, it's a difficult time and could become a very challenging financial environment for the state. Hasn't yet, but could be. So there's risk. So I think it's a totally fair point to begin ginning up the engines on that early and not waiting till we hit the cliff, although sometimes Albany waits till you hit the cliff before it does anything. On the larger issue of 3K, we were very explicit in the commitment that we made on 3K, that we were prepared to begin the rollout to 8 districts on our own, and that we would put city dollars up to do that. And we were also clear that we did not have the resources for universal pre-K, 3K through city dollars, and that our expectation was entirely consistent with what you said, Michael, that there would be a substantial state commitment to the 3K program. We were willing to do the startup of the 3K in districts with full city funding because A, we wanted to demonstrate how viable it was and how important it was for parents. B, we wanted to get it right and make sure we understood how to do it. C, to make sure we could operate at scale. We did pre-K in about 18 months, and it was hell to do, but we did it and got it's pretty stable now, and it's kind of an assumed thing as if it was always there, but as you point out, it was really a recent creation. This one we're rolling out because it's complicated. It's more complicated in many ways than pre-K, littler kids, smaller classes, different rules, different integration with other ACS programs. So we're rolling it out district by district. We just announced the next set of districts yesterday. But I think we've been very explicit from the outset. The city of New York cannot bear the cost of universal 3K on its own. It didn't for pre-K. It certainly can't for 3K. So that's going to be very high on our agenda. Probably not this year because we're probably okay for the next year's rollout. But after that, we have to turn to the state, 100%.
Eric Crump, CEC4. I also want to thank you for your commentary. When you spoke about the moving away from the team of rivals and moving more towards a collaborative effort with like-minded individuals that have a lot of commonality, I'm reminded of the saying that great things can be accomplished when nobody cares who gets the credit. I'd like to challenge you with the opposite of that, which is that it's hard to solve systemic problems if no one's willing to take any blame. And my question is, in coming into the administration and dealing with all these variety of agencies, as the model of a reformer, how do you push into an agency to address critical failures, systemic failures that they have had for years and years and years, without creating the adversarial relationship where the initial wall comes back up of saying you're trying to blame me, you're trying to target me, not just from the agency heads, but even all the way down to the rank and file individuals, individual cops and firefighters and teachers and building managers. How do you create reform where you're avoiding the pushback to say, stop trying to change things because you're just trying to blame me and single me out?
So look, it's a complicated and nuanced question. But it's something we face at every level, right? Everybody can walk, you know, you all have done this, you've all had multiple jobs, and the easiest thing to do is you walk in and you blame your predecessor for everything that was wrong. And you can kind of get away with that for a little while, but the problem for people like me, and for some of the people in this room, is I've been around a long time, right? So I've been both the predecessor and the successor, right? So I'm sensitive to the fact that most of these people in the Bloomberg administration, a lot of them were friends of mine. I thought a lot of them were very talented and committed people. So I'm not necessarily in the mode of blaming. I don't think that's a productive way to go. It's certainly not productive for a career civil service staff that's going to be here before you and after you. And for whom I think you have to have a certain amount, honestly, of respect and affection, even if you're frustrated as hell by some of the... First of all, many of them operate in rules we imposed on them. I'm not sure they'd all agree with all the rules we imposed on them, so I don't necessarily hold them responsible always for that. I am always very careful. I think agency heads I work with would know I don't do a lot of blaming of predecessors. I could say that wasn't as good as I would have made it, but maybe they did something else. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they didn't have the resources. I don't know. It's not ultimately important. What I do know is every one of us have been in and out of this government from multiple times, has made it better every time we've been here. That's most of why we're here. I don't think most of these people, and I mean way most of these people, come to work wanting to do a crappy job. Sure. They come to work wanting to do a good job, and they want to tell their kids they did a good thing, and that's why most of them are here. They don't get paid a lot of money. They don't get a lot of applause. They get the daily New York Post drubbing for how stupid they are. But most of them are here because they're trying to do the right thing. And I think if you can touch that core for most of them and then frame your change as we're trying to make it better, isn't that what you always wanted to do? And to do that in partnership with them, I don't find the blame tenses them up. The blame makes them defensive. That's not really my job. Interestingly, sometimes it's a mayor's job. A mayor represents the people to the government. He doesn't represent the government to the people, right? He's got to be the people's advocate here. So I think mayors, I've watched this with Koch plenty, and I watched it with his successor since, mayors are pretty free and should be blaming their government when things are wrong. That's their job, and demanding change and jumping up and down on us. But I think our job, my job as the sort of bureaucrat in chief, is to try and make sure that we can make change happen and make it real. And that, I think, takes a set of relationships with the people who work for you that doesn't build on blame, but finds core common values and builds off that.
Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you for your words this morning. Marvin Holland, Transport Workers Union. I have a kind of a two-part question. One, the city's recently proposed that they're going to put 10 electric stations around the city to recharge cars and stuff. Any idea where those stations will be going? And second, for the last couple of years, there's been rumored about electric school buses coming into the city. Any word on where we're at with that?
We haven't picked the locations yet. We sort of have a general sense of them. Obviously, you know more about this business. The electrical demands are not trivial here, particularly because those are supposed to be fast charging stations, was the idea. So you could get your electric car charged up to 80% in, I forgot what it was, 20 minutes, as opposed to the all-night charge that most of the charging stations are. That requires a fair amount of electrical grid capacity, and so we're talking with Con Ed and others about where those kinds of things can go and that won't put on bad demand on their system. So, but we know generally where we want to put them, and we want to encourage people to move towards electric cars as much as we can. And we think the world's moving that way anyway, and so the city should start to get itself ready for that. The issue of the school buses, as you know, we don't own and operate the school bus system. The long historic thing, I'm not sure it's always necessarily the best way to do things, but that's always been the city's history, is we contract it out. So we don't own the buses. The companies do. And so the question of electrification of that system is something we'd have to do in partnership with companies, because they have a set of assets that are their buses, and they'd have to convert them over time. Broadly, as part of our larger commitment to the Paris Accord, we are looking at buildings, at the transport system, and the waste system as the three places where we want to bring greenhouse gases down. In the transportation system, that means first and foremost a commitment to mass transit, which is the best thing to do, bicycles, other non-polluting modes of transportation, and then moving towards electrification of the vehicles. The city fleet is now moving heavily towards electrification. We're up to about an 87 mile per gallon average on our fleet, and that's because of constant movement towards electrification. Now, the next stage for that will be doing it for the bigger vehicles. The school buses are going to have to become part of that conversation at some point, but it's something we have to do in partnership with the companies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Listen, a round of applause for you. Stay right here. I want to thank the audience for being here and the questioners. I hope they're all excellent. And I'd like to say that one of the joys of doing this is to present city officials and others and have them talk. And what we heard today was really a wonderfully mature, experienced, wide-ranging, broad conversation. And we're lucky to have been here and to hear Tony. Thank you so much. As we always like to do, we like to give a product of the scholarship of this law school, so I present to Tony, I think this is the second time I've done this, the book by David Schoenbrod on D.C. Confidential is how Washington tricks us here in the States. So I give this as a manual. And thank you for a really memorable morning. Thank you so much. It was